After 11 months of negotiations, Israel's chief takeaway is alarm.
We look to Vienna and we're deeply troubled by what we see. For Israel and all the stability-seeking forces in the Middle East, the emerging deal, as it seems, is highly likely to create a more violent, more volatile Middle East.
They said that they were going to get a longer and stronger deal. This deal will be shorter and weaker.
Just days before an expected announcement, former State Department advisor on Iran, Gabriel Naronha, released information provided to him by current State Department officials.
My former colleagues I worked with, who were really so distressed by what they were seeing that they asked me to go public with these details because they said that Congress had not been informed and the American public hadn't been informed, and they were just so worried with the concessions that were being made by the negotiating teams that they felt that they needed to say something about it.
Naronha says the deal clears the way for a nuclear Iran.
Unfortunately, they're not getting any of the sunsets on Iran's nuclear restrictions lifted or extended. And so in only 9 years, Iran will have a clear path to a nuclear weapon. The American people need to know that this deal is illegal. It is dangerous to American national security. It's dangerous to the regional and global security in both the short term and in the long term.
Russia, a key player in these negotiations, wants written guarantees from the U.S. that sanctions from its war on Ukraine will not stop its trade with Iran. Israeli Prime Minister Bennett met with Putin on Saturday in Moscow about the war in Ukraine, although it's expected they discussed the nuclear deal and Russia's ongoing support for Iran. The deal would also reportedly provide billions in sanctions relief to Iran.
There are no restrictions in this deal on how that money will be spent and fueled to Iran's proxies. So we can expect that a lot is going to go to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. And so we're going to really see over the next few years, it might take a few months to get going, we're going to see a rapid proliferation of terrorist activity. We're going to see more destabilizing activity, and we're going to see Iran's influence and power grow in the region.
That power represents an existential threat to Israel.
Let me be clear. Israel will not accept Iran as a nuclear threshold state. Israel will always maintain its freedom of action to defend itself.
Israel's pledge to defend itself, along with Iran's nuclear ambition, puts these two enemies on a collision course for war. Gordon?
Well, Chris, what elements of this deal are so troubling?
Well, not only what Gabriel Naronha said, but the deal reportedly also removes sanctions from some of the top Iranian officials, including President Ibrahim Raisi. Raisi is known as the Butcher of Tehran. He's responsible for the deaths of about 5,000 political prisoners in the late 1980s. Another top official, Gordon, is Iranian cleric Ahmed Jannati. He's responsible for rigging the Iranian elections. He's responsible for these massive death to America, death to Israel rallies, and he's pushing for the regime to kill protesters. And it also appears, Gordon, that Iran will be able to keep some of its enriched uranium and the advanced centrifuges that it's put online since 2018. So these are additional reasons why Israel is so concerned about these deals and why many in Congress are as well.
Well, tell us about the reaction. What's the reaction in Congress?
Well, one thing the Congress has done, Gordon, is that Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Congressman Michael McCaul, he's the leading minority member on the Armed Services Committee, they sent a letter to Secretary of State Blinken, and they urged them to submit the final nuclear deal with Iran to congressional review. And what they do is they cite the Iranian Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. Now, what that act did is to require the president to submit any agreement within 5 days to the Congress. Now, McCarthy and McCaul and other senators and congressmen, they're alarmed that the administration may avoid this requirement by saying that the new agreement is just a continuation of the original 2015 agreement. And they say if the administration bypasses Congress, it'll be a violation of U.S. law. And also some senators like Jim Inhofe, Bill Hagerty from Tennessee, they're saying they'll do whatever they can to stop what they say is a very bad deal. And finally, we interviewed Senator Lindsey Graham here in Jerusalem just a few weeks ago, where he warned that Iran, it wants to destroy Israel, and it must not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon.
Well, we're hearing out of both Russia and China on this deal. What role did they play?
Well, a pretty big role, according to Mikhail Ulyanov. He's Russia's top negotiator. And just a few days ago, he was talking to reporters, and he bragged that China and Russia, they relied on each other during the negotiations. And he says that their joint efforts succeeded. He also said that the Iranian negotiators, they acted like lions, and that Iran got actually more than they expected. Now, some look and some put the blame on the U.S. chief negotiator. His name is Rob Malley, for those concessions. Now, Malley's on record as saying that it's a mistake to see Hezbollah and Hamas simply as terrorists, but they're social political movements. So it's his view of these groups and Iran that's making these concessions to Iran, and why in our report, Nahorna and these congressmen and senators, and why some of these negotiators resigned in protest, and why some others are leaking this information to make it public.
Well, I'm sorry, that's just idiotic. That's right up there with members of the Obama administration saying the Muslim Brotherhood was some kind of social organization. It just makes no sense. Is anybody paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine, that the West is absolutely limited in what it can do to help the Ukrainian war effort? And it's because Russia has nuclear weapons, and Putin's put that on the table. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, that is unbelievably destabilizing for the whole Middle East. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Is anybody looking at the military aspect of this?
Well, certainly here in Israel they are, and they're very, very concerned that what's happening while the world is being distracted by what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. Admittedly, they need to be concerned about that. But they're on this sideshow here in Vienna and what's going to happen and the concessions that they see the U.S. making. They're concerned that it really does pave the pathway to Iran to get a nuclear bomb. And as you say, that would be incredibly destabilizing, not only for the region, but for the world as well. On the other hand, to your point about trying to get weapons, we know that Zelensky is trying to get, the Ukrainian president is trying to get a no-fly zone, and there's a debate about that right now between many of the NATO countries. They're also perhaps bringing, MiGs from Poland to the fight there in Ukraine. But I think it's very, very difficult. And Gordon, I'll just add this. We were down at Ben Gurion Airport, and we saw about 160 Ukrainian Jews immigrating now because of the horrific war up there. And it's just gut-wrenching to hear their stories about what's happening there in Ukraine and how they've been separated for their families.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks for the report. Once again, be in prayer for the peace of Jerusalem. That's a commandment in the Bible, and we need to always seek peace for Israel and for Jerusalem.